It's a real treat to be at what is just an extraordinary event, and it's been a delight to hear from people from literally around the world. Ava Chamberlain gave you an edict before the first session, and because this is before the 13th session today, my edict is, if you do nod off and have to snore gently. When, in the fall of 1750, John Erskine received a letter from Jonathan Edwards written in July of that year, Erskine characteristically went into action. Immediately from his Kirkintilloch parish in Dunbartonshire, he contacted the Reverend James Robe in nearby Kilsyth. A few months earlier, Robe had shown Erskine a letter from Edwards in which the American had reported on the general, very dark and melancholy present state of religion in these parts of the world. But the paragraph of the letter to Robe that caught Erskine's attention was what Edwards had reported about the recent organization of an informal association of Massachusetts ministers, and in particular, Erskine was struck by the ministers' resolve to guide their congregation with the Westminster Assembly's catechism as containing an excellent system of divinity, and moreover to preach agreeably to the doctrines of the Bible exhibited in the catechism. As soon as Erskine and Robe were able to meet, they immediately agreed on the need to contact Thomas Gillespie, minister at Carnock and Fife, who had earlier shared with them the shocking news received in a letter from Edwards dated April 2nd of that year. I can now inform you that the controversy between me and my people has issued in a separation between me and my people. I desire your prayers that God would open a door to my further usefulness and provide for me and for my numerous family. But before Erskine and Robe could meet Gillespie, he proposed by post that the three of them recruit two other pastors, both also longtime correspondents with the New England minister, to join them in responding to what Edwards had written to Erskine. So it was that in January 1751, the five Scottish ministers, Erskine, Robe, Gillespie, William McCulloch, the Kirk pastor at Cambuslang, and John McLaren, gathered at McLaren's Ramsholme Church in Glasgow to ponder Edwards' words to Erskine, to pray about what they should do, and then to mobilize in response. As a wealth of sophisticated writing has shown for scholarly audiences, that meeting at the Ramshorn Church led to the momentous events of the next 2 decades, when their bold initiative changed the course of international evangelical history and came very close to making a decisive alteration in the history of what became the United States of America. Many in this audience know very well the scholarship to which I refer. It includes a demonstration by Gerald McDermott and Mark Valeri of Edwards' deep interest in civic, economic, and political matters, the comprehensive work by Richard Shear on the Scottish Enlightenment and by John McIntosh on what has been called the popular moderate divide, Jonathan Yeager's exhaustive research on John Erskine's extraordinary range of American correspondence, George Claiborne's Yale edition of Edwards' correspondence that includes so many letters to Scotland, Christopher Mitchell's detailed account of Edwards' Scottish friends, David Bebbington and Bruce Hindmarsh's insights on Edwards' reception among English and Scottish evangelicals, Michael McClyman and Gerald McDermott's demonstration of Edwards' unusually broad awareness of European theology. Not so well known yet is the research of my own PhD student, Ashley Foster, on ordinary Scots who were touched by the Great Revival in Cambuslang, and most recently the convincingly revisionist book by Gideon Mailer entitled John Witherspoon's American Revolution. And this is to say nothing of George Marsden's magnificent biography, however much that book subordinated the details of Edwards' Scottish career, and of the great work that Skip Stout, Ken Minkema, and their associates have done in making Edwards' scholarship into a thoroughly international enterprise. What we do not have at this point yet, however, is a simple general account written for those who do not know this excellent scholarship that provides a sketch of the last 20 years of Edwards' life, his surprisingly reserved activity during his years as a minister in the Scottish Kirk, and yet the great service to ecumenical Christianity and Anglo-Scottish American history he rendered during the time he lived in Scotland. It'll be tedious for this learned audience for me to sketch the outline of Edward's Scottish career, but hopefully that sketch will put us in position to see why Edwards, at the Scottish phase of his life, deviated somewhat from the theological pastoral course he had pursued in New England. Then how Edwards' mediation strengthened transatlantic evangelical networks, and finally why his influence on Scotland's most important immigrant to America of the era almost changed the course of American history. And so first, the basic outline of how Edwards got to Scotland and what he did once he got there. Edwards' letter to Erskine of July 5th, 1750 contained a lengthy account of what he called the distracting troubles and hurries that led to his dismissal from the Northampton church. He also reported that he had told Erskine several times before that the Northampton dispute had put an end for the present to the studies I was engaged in and my design to write against Arminianism. As the Scottish ministers together read Edwards' letter, they agreed to a man that there could be no more important desideratum in Christendom than encouraging Edwards to complete his contemplated work against Arminianism. But then as they continued, they were thrilled to hear what Edwards had written next. "You are pleased, dear sir," he says, addressing Erskine, "very kindly to ask me whether I could sign the Westminster Confession of Faith and submit to the Presbyterian form of church government, and to offer to use your influence to procure a call for me to some congregation in Scotland. As to my subscribing to the substance of the Westminster Confession, there would be no difficulty. And as to Presbyterian government, I have long been perfectly out of conceit with our unsettled, independent, confused way of church government in this land. And the Presbyterian way has ever appeared to me most agreeable to the Word of God and the reason and nature of things." The Scots did chuckle to themselves when Edwards added, "Though I cannot say that I think the Presbyterian government of the Church of Scotland is so perfect that it can't, in some respects, be mended." In the letter John Erskine wrote to Philip Doddridge soon after this meeting, he reported that John Maclaren and Thomas Gillespie had both, in Erskine's phrase, immediately affirmed that they too had cognizance of ameliorations they desired in our church, and more than only in some respects. Then the gathering sobered when they read Edwards' description of the many difficulties that I shrink at, when he thought about removing with my numerous family over the Atlantic. But again, all of them expressed personal disagreement when Edwards explained that it would be impossible to consider such a move given the uncertainty of traveling such a distance only to candidate before a particular congregation. They brightened considerably, however, when Edwards ended this part of his letter by saying, "My country is not so dear to me, but if there were an evident prospect of being more serviceable to Zion's interests elsewhere, I could forsake it, and I think my wife is fully of this disposition." After the content of Edwards' letter had been thoroughly digested, the five ministers paused to pray. Though a pause for prayer among 18th century Scottish ministers would today be considered more than a mere pause. They then turned to discuss the difficulties Edwards had raised with the unanimous reaction that though the difficulties were real, they could be surmounted. Money turned out to be the least of their worries. John Maclaren had already begun creating a relief fund as soon as he had learned that Edwards had been deposed. From his own parish, Maclaren knew that he could call on Andrew Buchanan, a trader grown wealthy from importing Virginia tobacco, co-founder of Glasgow's First Bank, and the sitting Lord Provost of Glasgow, for assistance. John Erskine offered to dip into his own family's considerable resources, and he knew that funding assistance might also come from Doddridge, the noted independent minister, hymn writer, and director of a renowned dissenting academy in England's Northampton. Edwards told his friends that Doddridge had been deeply moved when Erskine passed on Edwards' recent communication that even given the corruption of the day and the particular evils besetting England, Edwards rejoiced when he read Doddridge's Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul. For in Edwards' judgment, Doddridge, seems to have his heart truly engaged for the interest of religion. Erskine was certain that the extensive circle of English independents that included those who knew Watts and the still living Doddridge, but also English Baptists who held Edwards in a usually high regard, would gladly assist any effort to bring Edwards and his family to Britain, and so it proved. But what about a pulpit? Could they circumvent the very real objections Edwards had raised? They all knew the kirk was roiled with intensifying conflict over the competing rights of patrons to install ministers and the cherished prerogative of local kirk sessions to exercise their independent judgment on proposed ministers. Of this controversy, Thomas Gillespie had already been caught in the long-standing crossfire that soon thereafter would lead to the General Assembly dismissing him from his church at Carnock. Not surprisingly, it was John Maclaren who came up with a solution. To be sure, Edwards' relations with the others were secure. Edwards greatly appreciated John Erskine's diligence in passing on news about European church developments, and even more, the river of publications that Erskine directed toward Edwards. Toward McCullough and Robe, Edwards felt a special bond as leaders of the revival work at Cambuslang and Kilsyth that had been inspired by earlier awakenings in Northampton. Another powerful tie with these two was forged by the concert of prayer that joined Scotland, New England, places further afield, and asking God for renewed revivals of religion. And although Edwards and Gillespie had carried on a long epistolary dispute concerning the relation of personal assurance to genuine regeneration, Edwards greatly valued the warmth, charity, and magnanimity that shone so clearly in all of Gillespie's correspondence. Yet as much as Edwards treasured his connections with Erskine, McCullough, Robe, and Gillespie, it was obvious, as Chris Mitchell has detailed, that in temperament, intelligence, theological convictions, philosophical turn of mind, and general Christian sensibility, he stood closest to Maclaren. Much of what the other Scots knew of Edwards had been passed on from the long-standing and warmly appreciative correspondence that had passed between these two. That deep friendship rested on the solid ground of a nearly complete unity of spiritual vision. After Maclaren explained his solution to the other four ministers, they agreed that it was brilliant. He assured them that the financial resources of his Ramshorn church and the high regard that members of his session had many times expressed for what Edwards had written made it certain, indeed guaranteed, that the church would joyfully welcome Edwards as Maclaren's colleague minister. Moreover, the influence that Maclaren and leading elders like Provost Buchanan had so carefully cultivated their presbytery ensured that it would ratify the call. The discussion that greeted Maclaren's proposal extended for quite some time, but at the end, all five agreed that if presented persuasively, this proposal could transform the possibility of Edwards coming to Scotland into a reality. As is well known, it took some persuading to convince Edwards to make the move. The joint letter written by Erskine and Maclaren, along with endorsements from Provost Buchanan and the sitting moderator of Maclaren's Glasgow Presbytery, seemed to win over Sarah Edwards more readily than her husband. The crucial factor in making up Edwards' mind was a lengthy visit to Northampton by John Wright, a student at the College of New Jersey and a protege of the Middle Colony's leading Presbyterians, Samuel Davies and Aaron Burr. Wright had been born in Scotland before he immigrated to Virginia, where he immediately attached himself to Davies, who was seeking to plant Presbyterian churches in what he privately called this Anglican wilderness. As a student at Princeton, Wright became equally close to President Burr, whose admiration for Edwards knew no bounds. Wright's message to Edwards was straightforward. He knew from his youth how much the Presbyterians of his native land respected the Scriptures and in what great esteem they held the ministerial office. But he also reported a deep thirst for an active gospel message that could spark the banked coals of formal observance into the flame of true religion. In other words, Scotland offered Edwards a venue not unlike New England, but with a hereditary regard for the ministry that had been so conspicuously lacking in Edwards' experience with his Northampton congregation. Wright's first-hand explanation of this Scottish situation definitely did his part, but Edwards was also reassured by John Wright's close association with Samuel Davies. Edwards had met Davies on his one earlier visit to New Jersey and the college at Princeton, after which he reported to McCullough, "I was much pleased with Mr. Davies and his conversation. He seemed to me very solid and discreet, and of a very civil, genteel behavior, as well as fervent and zealous in religion." So it came to pass that 15 months to the day, after Edwards had written about his willingness to accept the call to Scotland, on the 5th of October, 1751, an eager crowd of well-wishers hailed a ship, the Visible Union, that along with a substantial tonnage of tobacco carried the Edwards family up the River Clyde to dock at the port of Glasgow. Before the crises of the mid-1750s, Edwards' early years in Scotland exceeded the hopes of all concerned. The assignment as Maclaurin's colleague in Glasgow worked splendidly. Edwards preached regularly, but mostly from manuscripts he had brought with him from America, and significantly, these sermons concentrated not on intense application of high Calvinist doctrine, but on open-hearted and Christ-centered proclamations of the gospel. Sarah and the children settled in well. Daughters Sarah and Esther, who had married Aaron Burr shortly after most of the family left for Scotland, had remained behind. After accompanying the family, Mary, Lucy, and Timothy Edwards soon returned to the colonies, where Timothy began study with his new brother-in-law, Aaron Burr, at Princeton, while the daughters wed husbands from the families of long-standing friends and established their own families. Not insignificantly, Edwards enjoyed the relative leisure to complete his long germinating work against Arminianism. Curiously, when the book appeared, Scotland provided the earliest and most troubling early notice of a careful and strict inquiry into the modern prevailing notions of that freedom of will which is supposed to be essential to moral agency, virtue and vice, reward and punishment, praise and blame. Now, the response came from Henry Home, Lord Kames, and I did actually treat this in several pages for an essay that Ken published in a nice collection for the tricentennial, so we're going to skip Henry Home and Edwards, except to say that Edwards was concerned in his reasoning about the will that people should turn from nature and rely upon grace, whereas Henry Home, Lord Kames, was trying to show how magnificent nature was and nature's God. Personally, Edwards also enjoyed a number of encouraging visits from acquaintances with strong American connections. Early in his Glasgow years, Edwards and George Whitefield enjoyed several lengthy conversations during the one of the Grand Itinerant's periodical tours of the Northern Kingdom. As Edwards reported to John Maclaurin, he found the evangelist in a more desirable temper of mind and more solid and judicious in his thoughts and prudent in his conduct. Then in 1753, he was able to renew what had only been fleeting friendships with Samuel Davies and Gilbert Tennant when they showed up in Glasgow. These Middle Colony Presbyterians were there to raise money for the College of New Jersey, a project that Edwards supported wholeheartedly with no small contribution to raising the 4,000 pounds they carried back to President Aaron Burr in Princeton. The most important observation about these early Scottish years was doubtless Edwards' notable moderation in temperament. To be sure, the convictions he shared, especially with Maclaurin, did not waver. As his writings demonstrated, he remained a God-centered Calvinist, keen to promote true religion, wary of enthusiastic excess, unapologetic about his beatific vision of absolute divine sovereignty, and insistent that truly Christian ethics required the supernatural illumination of the Holy Spirit. Yet the person behind the publications was changing. As he said to Thomas Gillespie, I would be far from so laying all the blame of the sorrowful things that have come to pass to the people in Northampton as to suppose that I have no cause for self-reflection and humiliation before God on this occasion. God knows the wickedness of my heart. I desire that God would discover them to me more and more, and that he now would effectively humble and mortify my pride. His other Scottish colleagues also received many indications of this more self-aware and flexible Edwards. With McCullough, he loved trying to interpret current events as the fulfillment of biblical prophecies. But he also repeatedly told the Cambuslang minister that on such matters, I am by no means dogmatical. To James Robe, he defended the sermons he had preached on hellfire, but he also conceded that he was learning to balance fear, the legal principle, with love, the evangelical principle. His personal relationship with John Erskine was particularly noteworthy since it became almost immediately clear to both of them that unlike Edwards and Maclaren, Edwards and Erskine differed substantially on important points of theology. Erskine, to be sure, energetically distributed Edwards' freedom of the will, and Erskine gave Edwards the books of John Taylor that Edwards attacked in the great Christian doctrine of original sin, which the relaxed demands of his Scottish duties allowed him to publish in 1758. Yet as Jonathan Yeager has shown, Erskine was a resolute intellectualist on the will who rejected voluntarism even after Edwards showed him in patient conversation, these are Edwards' phrases, the palpable inconsistency and absurdity of views like his own, as well as the great insult against the gospel of Jesus Christ, when those, again like Erskine, claim that traditional Calvinistic notions of God's moral government are contrary to the common sense of mankind. Erskine's rationalistic mentality was also completely alien to the metaphysical realism that Edwards developed as a framework for his treatment of original sin. Yet with Erskine, Edwards continued to enjoy to what could only be called warm personal fellowship. Gratitude for all that Erskine had done for Edwards in providing books and much more was palpably the reason. When Edwards explained to Erskine why he thought that ministers should shun that bastard, mischievous charity by which Satan keeps men asleep when evaluating purported conversions, he also told Erskine convincingly that I am a great enemy of censoriousness. If, as he concluded, Erskine agreed with him that the purpose of religion was a disposition to give all the glory of our salvation to God in Christ, then he could live with their differences. By no means did Jonathan Edwards step off the deck of the visible union and become a wishy-washy moderate, but he did leave on board at least some of the polemical edge, some of the stiff authoritarianism, some of the my way or the highway mentality that had marked his Massachusetts ministry. But then, as is well known, came the tragedies and tumults that seemed to mock the conviction that God had led Edwards to Scotland. From the colonies came news of the untimely deaths of the Edwards' son-in-law, Aaron Burr, and even more disconcertingly, of their daughter Esther, who more than any of their children had shared her father's intelligence and her mother's piety. The only silver lining from this very dark clouds were reports that came regularly from Esther's brother Timothy, who had handed the Burrs' orphan son, young son Aaron Jr., to the childless family of a young trustee of the College of New Jersey, Elias Boudinot, where the junior Burr was growing into a young adult marked by seriousness of purpose, moral probity, and an ardent desire to follow his father and grandfather into the Christian ministry. Also close to home, Edwards is devastated when John Maclaren succumbed suddenly to an attack of apoplexy in late 1754. But the harshest blow came shortly thereafter when Sarah Edwards, who had so willingly moved with her family to Scotland, also passed away. Yet even this devastating loss, Edwards characteristically turned, as was he wont, into an edifying purpose. John Erskine had repeatedly asked him to write something, however brief, against the attack on miracles found in David Hume's Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Edwards had been much impressed by the acuity of Hume's reasoning, whom he called a man of considerable genius, but not until after Sarah's death did he accede to Erskine's urgings. The result was indeed a very short, but also penetrating essay. I sort of explained what Hume's objections to miracles were, but this is a learned audience, and you know all that. The short pamphlet that Edwards wrote at Erskine's urging focused on Hume's trust in experience. He asked first, why should Hume think that experience revealed the laws of nature when the skeptic Hume himself conceded that when he spoke of proof from experience, he meant only a strong probability, but not a demonstration. Edwards, by contrast, made an argument resembling what Nicholas Walterstorff would contend centuries later in Reason Within the Bounds of Religion. Experience gives us potentially reliable information about the world because that is just the way things are. No foundationalist argument is needed to rely, of course critically, on experience. But then he made a move that Bishop Berkeley and Nicholas Malebranche had also made, that the overarching reason to trust experience is because God created the world. God created the human mind, and God made it possible for the human senses to discover at least potentially true things about the world. But then Edwards recounted once again the time when Sarah had experienced a more than natural period of intense spiritual illumination. As Edwards had written in 1742 for some thoughts concerning the present revival of religion, against those who questioned the heaven-sent possibility of true religion, now he repeated against Hume that he knew personally he had experienced someone whose soul dwelt on high, was lost in God, and seemed also to leave her body. Her mind dwelt in a pure delight that fed and satisfied it, enjoying pleasure without the least sting or any interruption. Edwards ended his pamphlet with a simple statement that it was impossible not to believe his wife's account of her experience, and so entirely possible to credit the reality of what she had experienced. External shocks exacerbated the shocks of these personal sorrows. As we shall see, the outbreak of warfare with France jarred Edwards, not least in disturbing his relationship with fellow revivalists George Whitefield and Samuel Davies. The spread of active fighting from French Quebec into frontier New England created special worry concerning Edwards' son and namesake, Jonathan Edwards, Jr., who had only shortly before returned from Scotland for pre-collegiate education with Timothy Woodbridge at a mission in frontier western Massachusetts sponsored by the Scottish Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. The confusion of the times must have been excruciating for someone who read events as the outworking of divine providence. Moreover, Edwards was for a time forced to handle all preaching duties at the Ramshorn Kirk. As a consequence, he was secretly relieved when the Kirk session and presbytery informed him that as much as they appreciated his service, they were going to ask their new minister to serve as pastor by himself. Relief at release from onerous duties did not, however, show Edwards a path ahead. Should he, as a widower with 4 growing children still under his care, return to an uncertain future in New England? Must he beg for charity from the Scottish friends who had already proven so generous? Dilemmas abounded. Until, that is, a rising young minister who had studied divinity alongside John Erskine in Edinburgh came to the rescue. Since 1745, John Knox Witherspoon had pastored the Kirk in Bath, Ayrshire, where he had gained a reputation for forceful preaching and, more importantly, for resolute defense of local session prerogatives. Witherspoon's biting satire from 1753, Ecclesiastical Characteristics, lampooned the social pretensions, the lust for power, and the intellectual adventurism of Scottish ministers who embraced the progressive principles of the European Enlightenment. Witherspoon's stiff defense of lay Presbyterians and his moderate adherence to the Westminster Standards had made him the de facto leader of the church's so-called popular party over against the so-called moderates. While not an all-out supporter of the Cambuslang and Kilsyth revivals, as Erskine had been, Witherspoon was still willing to be known as an evangelical, in contrast to the humanistic principles of the moderates. His fame, or notoriety, made him increasingly attractive candidate for the large urban pulpits that were aligned with the popular party. Edwards came to view that popularity as a direct sign of God's leading. From the wealthy lay kirk or low church in the booming textile city of Paisley, issued a pastoral call to Witherspoon, he replied with an unusual request. Yes, he would come, but only if Jonathan Edwards could be installed as his colleague pastor and serve him with him as he had earlier served with John McLaren. Witherspoon had not been close to Edwards, but his location in Bath, not far from Glasgow, had allowed him to hear Edwards preach on several occasions, to enjoy fleeting personal contact, and most of all, to gain great respect for the American's theology and his intellect. So it came to pass that in 1758, the Paisley Low Church warmly welcomed its two new ministers, the younger Witherspoon, who immediately embarked on a whirlwind of preaching, disputing, organizing, and maneuvering, and the older and increasingly infirm Edwards, who was allowed to fade serenely into a peaceful support role as an occasional preacher and theological resource for the many Scots who treasured the person whose works they found so edifying. Thus began the last phase of Jonathan Edwards' life. Witherspoon, the Paisley congregation, and a wider reading public took note when Edwards dedicated the paired works he published in 1765 to the session of the lay kirk, the end for which God created the world, and the nature of true virtue. The second of this pair, we will soon see, would create a most important echo in Witherspoon himself when he migrated to the colonies. Edwards also continued to work steadily in two large projects. The first that he described to his friends as a great work, which I call A History of the Work of Redemption, and a second, a great work, which I call The Harmony of the Old and New Testament. It seems Edwards was hindered from finishing A History of the Work of Redemption by his extensive reading in the very different kinds of histories published by David Hume and William Robertson. Edwards thoroughly repudiated the naturalistic framework of their history writing, but he was impressed enough with the intellectual quality of these authors to plan an explanation for how his providential history and histories with God left out might actually inform each other. Sadly, he did not live to fulfill that plan. Reasons for not finishing his Harmony of the Old and New Testament are happier. The leisure that the lay kirk allowed Edwards gave him almost unlimited time to peruse the scriptures. As Doug Sweeney and his associates have demonstrated, Edwards' dedication to the Bible was so extensive and so supernally satisfying that at Paisley, Edwards kept making note after note after note in his biblical studies, but simply did not get round to assembling the notes into a published volume. One other development of these years was, of course, very important. When in 1766, the trustees of the College of New Jersey reached out to Witherspoon after the death of Aaron Burr's successor, Samuel Finley, Edwards played a crucial role in persuading Mrs. Elizabeth Witherspoon that the upset of a transatlantic migration could be worthwhile. Along with Benjamin Rush, then a young medical student in Edinburgh, and Richard Stockton, the scion of a wealthy Princeton family and later a signer of the Declaration of Independence, who was reading law in Scotland, Edwards pitched in to explain the extended influence Witherspoon could exercise in the colonies. Edwards' words to Mrs. Witherspoon about how successfully his own wife had managed the admittedly difficult journey across the ocean were largely responsible for gaining her approval. For our purposes, two results from Edwards' years at Paisley are most noteworthy. First, that time led to a surprising ecumenical breakthrough. Second, it played a decisive role in what would happen in the colonies from which he had immigrated. The ecumenical breakthrough involved Edwards' increasingly warm relations with a surprisingly wide range of English and Scottish Protestants who often had little time for each other. If we had a lot of time, we could talk about his friendly relations with a whole string of Anglicans, several Baptists, and actually in Scotland, Edwards remained just about the only person who could communicate with the Kirk, the Seceders of the Erskines, and then the Relief Church of John Gillespie. The most important ecumenical development came, however, from another direction. Well into his years in Scotland, Edwards shared with John Erskine an exceedingly low opinion of the Methodist movement generally and of John and Charles Wesley in particular. The opinion he expressed to Erskine shortly after his arrival, and that Erskine in characteristic fashion broadcast widely, left no doubt. The Wesleys, according to Edwards, propagated the worst follies of the Moravians. To Edwards, they seemed strangely akin to the enthusiasts he had known in America who were extravagant people, promoting false religion, counterfeit conversion, and the want of a genuine renovation of the spirit of their minds. Two memorable visits with John Wesley changed Edwards' mind, not to be sure completely, for he remained a stern opponent of the Arminianism from which the Wesleys never retreated. The visits instead moved Edwards from his stance as an implacable foe of anything, even remotely Wesleyan, to a charitable, if still begrudging, admission that at least some true religion could result from the Wesleys' labors. The first visit occurred shortly after his tenure began at Paisley. Wesley was making one of his regular visits to Scotland's small but rapidly growing Methodist movement. One of the many lay Kirk's weavers, whose Paisley cloth enjoyed a high reputation around the world, arranged the visit and left a nearly verbatim record that Bruce Hindmarsh has recently discovered in the attic of the weaver's family's descendants. The visit began unpropitiously with Edwards' brusque query asking Wesley why he so maliciously edited Edwards' works that he had abridged for his Methodist connection. Wesley responded by admitting that he had edited the works with what he acknowledged as considerable severity. But then he explained how each of the 5 works he had so abridged, faithful narrative, distinguishing marks, some thoughts, the life of Brainerd, and religious affections, had played a part in several conversions, and for many more readers, the deepening of their lives of faith. Hardly mollified, Edwards shot back that the parts Wesley had cut out constituted the theological bedrock on which these works rested. The conversation was going nowhere and seemed about to end when Wesley turned in another direction. Wesley said he had been informed that while in the colonies, Edwards had begun to add occasional hymns by Isaac Watts to his congregation's regular singing of the Psalms. Edwards acknowledged that he had done so. Edwards then asked if the report he had received from Thomas Gillespie was correct, that while Edwards opposed the ecclesiology of the seceder Ralph Erskine, Edwards was an appreciative reader of Erskine's collections of poems entitled Gospel Sonnets. When Edwards responded affirmatively, Wesley asked if Edwards would accept the gift of a poetic collection that he had edited from the work of his brother Charles. It was called Hymns and Spiritual Songs, which had been published some years earlier. Edwards accepted the book, with only a minimal expression of gratitude, and the apparently fruitless meeting was over. Yet some time later, during a visit with John Erskine, Edwards was at pains to mention this book. Erskine, who had earlier written about the Methodist president in Scotland with at least toleration, was just at that time gearing up for an all-out attack on the Wesleys and their movement. As Jonathan Yeager has shown, when Erskine went on the offensive, the Wesleys' reputation suffered and Methodist recruitment stalled in Scotland. But as Erskine explained why he was going public against the Wesleys, Edwards offered a curious riposte. He said he understood Erskine's enmity and probably even supported Erskine's public opposition. But he went on to say that he had found much in Charles Wesley's hymns and spiritual songs that personally warmed his heart. In particular, he told Erskine he found one poem entitled Wrestling Jacob, especially beautiful, as it depicted the man of Genesis 32 who wrestled all night with Jacob as the God-man, the Son of Righteousness, whose nature and whose name was love. Edwards explained that he had preached on this passage several times and also written several long notes to himself in his journals, notebooks. But he had usually emphasized the wrestling aspect of the story. In his sermons, he called the wrestling a type for believers when they too found themselves in long and desperate struggle. Edwards was not abandoning that interpretation, but he told Erskine the eyes of his heart had now seen something more in the story. He was, in short, grateful to John Wesley for the gift of the book and to Charles for the gift of the poem. Edwards' second visit with John Wesley took place in 1769 when Edwards knew that his time on earth was short. Erskine's reproaches had done their work. The Methodist movement in Scotland was on its heels. Wesley was not in a happy frame of mind when he arrived in Paisley to encourage what had become a sharply reduced local society. Again, it was an elder in the lay kirk who remained in connection with the Wesleys who brought the two together. Edwards was in a reflective mood. The lay kirk continued to provide for his needs, but all of his children had returned to America, and he was missing the companionship he had enjoyed with Witherspoon. And so the two veterans who shared so much in their devotion but differed so much in their theology did not reprise earlier points of disagreement, but ruminated together about how a spirit of love might just possibly join all those together who long for true religion. Edwards told Wesley, as he had earlier told Thomas Gillespie, that he regretted his harshness in dealing with this Northampton congregation, and that he appreciated Gillespie's example, who had reacted to being expelled from the kirk with friendly forbearance. Wesley, for his part, told Edwards about something he had experienced more than 3 decades previously, and again it dealt with music in praise of God. As Edwards knew, Wesley had experienced a decisive moment of reassuring faith at a Moravian assembly in London in the spring of 1738. Almost immediately thereafter, he resolved to visit Count von Zinzendorf's headquarters in the eastern German lands. The incident he shared with Edwards took place in the course of that trip when Wesley and his small party rested for a few days en route in the Saxon city of Leipzig. Wesley knew that Edwards greatly valued hymns that honored Christ, but also that with Wesley, Edwards found elaborate musical settings off-putting, and especially the contrapuntal singing of different words all jumbled together at the same time. In Leipzig, Wesley had been greatly edified by reading the manuals prepared for Sunday worship at the city's main Lutheran churches. Lyrics from these musical pieces in the manuals moved him deeply with a compelling focus on Christ and the sinner's sole hope found in the dying and rising Son of Righteousness. But then Wesley attended a Sunday service and was horrified. The beautiful lyrics were sung with blaring trumpets, a deafening organ, and the words hopelessly mishmashed so that even someone with excellent German could hardly make them out. Edwards could imagine, Wesley said, how disappointed, how even angry he felt to have such lyrics so wantonly abused. But then Wesley went on, he had an opportunity to meet the choir master who apparently composed the music, as well as playing the organ as he directed the choir. In a mixture of German and Latin, Wesley communicated his disappointment. The choir master began a sharp response, but then paused again and asked, "What was your name?" When Wesley replied, the choir master said, "Could you possibly be related to a certain Charles Wesley?" For although the German knew only rudimentary English, he had read several hymns or poems by a Charles Wesley that had touched his heart. And there the conversation in Leipzig ended. To Edwards, Wesley then said he looked upon what he had learned in Leipzig as a guide for how he now felt about Edwards, a person whose Calvinism was just as offensive as contrapuntal singing, but whose Christianity he esteemed. Edwards did not immediately respond, but it was obvious he pondered Wesley's account of this long-ago incident. Edwards' time, of course, was about up, but Wesley would live another quarter century before he died. Many of his own Methodist societies had begun to sing hymns written by Isaac Watts, Joseph Hart, John Newton, and even Augustus Toplady. In other words, authors suspect for their varying degrees of Calvinism. By that time as well, independent congregations and chapels in the Lady Huntington's connection were singing hymns by Charles Wesley, and the Wesley's hymns had come to enjoy a surprisingly wide circulation in the homes of Scottish Presbyterians who, naturally enough, would never sing them in church. The softening of Edwards' original antagonism to the Methodists had done its part in contributing to the emergence of a transnational evangelical Protestantism, where theological differences still mattered, but hymn singing meant even more. The second notable influence from Edwards' Scottish career came through John Witherspoon. But this influence was also almost impossible to imagine or to recognize before Gideon Mailer cleared away what many historians, including myself, had written about Witherspoon's time in America. A subordinate question related to Edwards' influence on Witherspoon is whether Edwards, had he lived, would have supported American independence, and here I think the question has to be open. We've got quite a long discussion of that. but it ends by quoting George Marsden by saying, Edwards was in many respects a thoroughly 18th century traditionalist. So whatever might have pushed him toward independence, he was held back by a conservative constitution. The main point, however, is that whatever Edwards would have done, he definitely influenced Witherspoon, who definitely supported the revolution. But now the scholarship of Gideon Mailer must come center stage. For with thorough research on both sides of the Atlantic, he has provided a compelling new understanding of the Scottish minister who in 1768 came to Princeton and 8 years later signed the Declaration of Independence. Again, the book is John Witherspoon's American Revolution, the best book ever done on 18th century American Presbyterianism. First, close attention to Witherspoon's lectures in moral philosophy, his sermons, and his instruction to Princeton students in divinity shows that the influence of Francis Hutcheson and other Scottish philosophers of common moral sense was less than many of us had thought. Witherspoon did employ Hutcheson's common sense categories, but he always maintained that for genuine morality, the work of God's grace was even more foundational than anything delivered by natural moral reasoning. Mailer concedes that Witherspoon's articulation of this relationship, supernatural conversion as base, natural moral reasoning as superstructure, lacked Edwards' painstaking precision. But when we realize that Edwards was finishing his work on the nature of true virtue, right as it were under Witherspoon's nose, it should be obvious that Edwards' limited appreciation for naturally occurring virtues like self-love and his passionate defense of true virtue as requiring a divine and supernatural light defined almost exactly Witherspoon's less precise account of the same relationship. Second, Mailer shows that Witherspoon's promotion of the American Revolution, including the influential sermon he preached in June 1776, The Dominion of Providence over the Passions of Men, differed considerably from the biblical reasoning so powerfully expressed in so many sermons from New England. The differences can be summarized under the heads of typology and ideology. For Witherspoon, the emerging United States was not, repeat, not the new Israel. Witherspoon's support for the revolution rested on his analysis of Parliament's malfeasance and a belief that God's providential hand favored the Americans. But as Mailer shows, Witherspoon also retained great affection for Scotland as a political entity and an even deeper commitment to evangelical Protestantism throughout Britain and on the continent as well. In fact, he hoped that the passions of war could quickly subside so that all Protestants devoted to true religion, wherever they are found, could band together to resume in a post-imperial world what British Protestants had begun to achieve under the British Empire. Ideologically, Witherspoon did share the colonists' Republican calculus. Virtue supported the freedom without which social well-being was impossible. Vice promoted the corruption that led to tyranny. But unlike many other Americans, Witherspoon held that the new American nation was just as imperiled by the threat of corruption as was the British Empire. His noteworthy sermon of 1776 did distinguish between Britain's tyrannical action and the dangers besetting the nascent nation, but that was a difference in quantity rather than quality. Liberty was a sacred cause, but never intended for just the new United States. Witherspoon's even-handed moral realism thus avoided the nationalistic millennialism of so many of his patriotic peers, and also the conspiratorial thinking that would soon lead Jonathan Edwards' grandson, Timothy Dwight, to veer from ecstatic enthusiasm for America to apocalyptic panic about its descent into pagan illuminism. The ways that Jonathan Edwards' direct influence came to bear on Witherspoon's stance during the Revolution are numerous, almost beyond counting. First, millennialism. As Gerald McDermott, Michael McClyman, Douglas Sweeney, and others have shown, Edwards in the early 1740s did opine that New England might witness the millennial dawn. But when he became disillusioned about the prevalence of false religion in his native region, he adopted the millennial expectation that dominated the rest of his life. There would definitely be a millennium, but it would come as gospel righteousness spread through the whole world. For Edwards, the millennium represented a hope unto God for the world and not any particular nation. Second, international ecumenicity. One of Edwards' strongest inducements to immigrate had been the fellowship he sustained with his Scottish friends when they had banded together in the concert of prayer, asking God to advance his kingdom throughout the whole world. In his short years in Glasgow, Edwards frequently expressed the hope to John Maclaren. He said, "I hope the time is hastening when God's people in all the different parts of the world and the whole earth shall become more sensibly, as it were, one family, one holy and happy society." When John Witherspoon described the American Revolution as only a temporary impediment for a much-desired international fellowship of like-minded Protestants looking forward to a transnational correspondence of fellowship, he articulated in an American setting what he had learned from Jonathan Edwards in Scotland. Third, dangers for the ones on top. As so manifestly a participant in elite British culture, Edwards entertained conventional views about the cultural inferiority of the Irish, Highlanders, and Native Americans. Yet it was striking that when Edwards received communications from his son about mission work among the Stockbridge Indians, he wrote back to Jonathan Jr. with a warning about confusing cultural inferiority with spiritual incapacity. Natives, he wrote, have the same potential for loving and serving God as the British, or even, given the corruption so obviously besetting both England and New England, a greater likelihood of experiencing true repentance and genuine renovation of life. For Witherspoon, similarly to call for American independence, was never the same as considering the United States morally exceptional. He had learned his lesson well from Edwards about the dangerous error of short-sighted filiopietism. Fourth, ideology. To at least some degree, Edwards shared the political instincts that led the colonists to revolution. To Thomas Gillespie, he showed he was ideologically au courant by explaining how the contentious factions in the Northampton church had resembled, these are Edwards' words now, the court and country parties in England, if I may compare small things with great. The country was jealous of the court, apt to envy him, and afraid of losing too much influence in town and church. But Edwards never really took to the Christian republicanism that propelled the revolution because of his experiences during the 7 years of French and Indian Wars. That conflict gave him pause for several reasons. He first became nervous in reading about the prominent role of Boston's Jonathan Mayhew in applying real Whig analysis to relations between the mother country and the colonies. In anticipation of Jonathan Clark's recent scholarship, Edwards connected Mayhew's heterodoxy with his strong republicanism. Individuals like Mayhew, who gave up on original sin, and hence on the need for an atonement provided by God in Christ, turned easily to thinking that the responsibility for good and evil in this world lay ultimately with human actors instead of divine providence. Edwards agreed that Parliament mishandled its imposition of a stamp tax after the end of the French War, but he could not agree that its legislative bumbling bespoke a grand tyrannical conspiracy threatening the entirety of colonial well-being. Edwards also early on became nervous about substituting the implications of contemporary political analysis for trust in God's providence. This nervousness expanded when he heard from the colonies about Samuel Davies' inflammatory sermons during the war, and when George Whitefield described the same conflict similarly. In both cases, Edward thought that his esteemed colleagues in promoting revival were betraying their earlier efforts by depicting war with France as ultimate struggle between God and Satan. They erred in losing sight of even more fundamental realities. Edwards, of course, as we've heard several times already, gave no ground in opposing to anyone imposing Roman Catholicism. For Edwards, attending to the news from around the world simply meant tracking the course of the beast of the book of Revelation. Yet unlike his evangelical friends, he did not equate victory over the French with victory over Satan. When Edwards passed on accounts of military developments in the colonies to his Scottish friends, there was no mistaking his partisanship for the armies of General Braddock and Colonel George Washington. But unlike similar reports from Davies and Whitfield, which were apocalyptic in the extreme, Edwards did so analytically rather than apocalyptically. Freedom for Edwards meant only secondarily defeat of the French. Its primary meaning remained trust in God and loyalty to Christ. Entirely foreign to him was a typological practice that began during King George's War in the 1740s and grew in strength with every succeeding military conflict. Edwards had no interest in nabbing bits of Old Testament history or snippets from the Psalms as if they portended the fate of colonial America. Only rarely did Edwards read Old Testament types as anticipating fulfillment as political antitypes. Instead, his antitypes remained resolutely spiritual, and thus very much opposed to how American ministers across the theological spectrum so casually interpreted current events as reprising the Old Testament history of Israel. Unlike Jonathan Edwards, John Witherspoon was not much of a typologist. But like Edwards, he did not believe that real Whig ideology explained ultimate reality. With Edwards, he maintained a specifically Christian, internationally focused reserve about the supposedly unique blessings enjoyed by the new American nations. It was Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson who proposed Israel's escape from Egypt as a seal of the United States, and not John Witherspoon. Witherspoon did support the revolution, which Edwards may not have been able to do, question there, but Witherspoon put to use in America what Edwards had taught him about the relative value of political freedom compared to the absolute value of liberty in Christ. So, in the unfolding of history, few Americans followed the course that Witherspoon advocated by maintaining patriotism as an important but secondary concern. The opposing testimonies would be to forget God, or, with George Bancroft, Josiah Strong, Woodrow Wilson, Ronald Reagan, and many more, to believe that God had made the United States a unique recipient of his providential concern. Had more citizens followed Witherspoon's path, in which he had been so clearly grounded by Jonathan Edwards, American history might have unfolded differently. As it was, Jonathan Edwards' years in Scotland did direct evangelical history to warmer transnational and trans-denominational fellowship, and that was only one of the many significant things that took place when Edwards responded positively to John Erskine when in 1750 the Scotsman called, as if the Macedonian to the Apostle Paul, "Come over and help us." Thank you. Well, I think what I tried to argue in America's God is that there's a real decisive shift in the coming in of Republican ideology as a main influence on actually theological traditions of all sorts, and Edwards barely shared that, or did not share that. I think Edwards actually would have agreed with Jonathan Clark, that because if Mayhew likes something, I'm going to be really nervous about it. Jan?
I have a question there. One reason why Edwards might have felt so right at home in Scotland, could this have been sort of a shared sense of provincial identity? Could you talk about this sense of New England and Scotland in the British Empire, and in addition to sort of a shared dissenting evangelical religion?
That the sense of Scottish and New England fellow feeling, because of being both provinces, was expressed, some of you know memorably, more than 60 years ago, Bernard Balin and very young John Clive, in an article in the William Mary Quarterly. And actually, this is one of the points that Gideon Mailer picks up, that Witherspoon is in Scotland nervous about England. And when he comes to America, he's still nervous about England, but he's not nervous about the potential of spiritual, theological fellowship with people in England, or still in Scotland, or in America. So yes, I think along with the fact that what this John Wright, who was not a made-up person, I made up what he said to Edwards, but what a Scottish person born in Scotland may have told Edwards was, look, our ministers argue with each other all the time, but congregations that respect ministers, I think that would have been a factor too. But yes, the provincial, the ties that had brought together Benjamin Coleman and Thomas Woodrow, that brought Edwards together with these five and more Scots, they were very real.
So I'm just curious. We know that Edwards really wanted to study Hebrew, and he loved Petrus von Maastricht.
Yeah.
And one of Petrus von Maastricht's schoolmates was Cornelius Hendrikus Elbugius. Is there any chance that during Edwards' time in Scotland, did he ever have any contact or opportunity to study any of Elbugius's material?
But I think the answer to that question comes from a perusal of the card catalog at the University of Glasgow Library. I wouldn't be surprised, though. I mean, if in fact work on the history of the work of redemption and the great harmony of the Old and New Testament did not take place simply because Edwards died too soon, it's conceivable that had he begun to learn Hebrew, it would have also retarded his work on completing the manuscript linking the New Testament and the Old Testament. He did, John Erskine, as Jonathan Yeager knows, sent him all these books all the time, and he occasionally would send a book in French, and Edwards would write back, well, I don't read French, so this book's not going to be any good for me. I'm guessing he probably would have learned French, too. It wouldn't have taken him more than a week or two.
Mark, do we know from contemporaneous sources how similar or different spoken Scottish English was from the English spoken in British North America? And if so, would Edwards have needed an interpreter to preach in Scotland?
Well, it's actually, I mean, that's a question that does have some historical, empirical evidence. John Adams said he went to hear Witherspoon preach a couple different times and really liked this, he used what he was a phrase, this warm, some cuddly, not his word, old Scotsman, but I could barely understand a word of his sermon. But that was New England, and Benjamin Rush and Richard Stockton were studying in Scotland and did convince Mrs. Witherspoon to come to America, and they had no trouble communicating with her. My guess is that levels of education would have made a big difference. I mean, I've gone to Ireland and gone to a store and not be able to understand a word. Supposedly it's English. So.
Well, that's all I do, Mark.
Yeah, thank you.